Welcome to the Silent Empires. Tonight, step into the shadowed world of Carlos Marcello, the quiet but ruthless boss of New Orleans, whose influence stretched far beyond the bayous and into the highest halls of power. As you close your eyes, imagine the secret meetings, the whispered bargains, and the empire built behind a calm smile and an iron will. Before we begin, share your city and the time you're listening in the comments. I love seeing where these stories reach. And if you enjoy sleeping stories of gangsters and forgotten empires, be sure to subscribe and join our growing family. Now, settle in and let the silence carry you away. He was born Calogero in 1910 in the port city of Tunis to Sicilian parents who soon sought new chances across the ocean. The family reached New Orleans while he was still a child. They settled near the French market, where the lines between fresh produce, street bargaining, and neighborhood loyalties formed the daily lesson plan. His father ran a stall. Money came in small bills and coins, earned one basket at a time. The boy learned how to weigh fruit fast, keep an eye on the crowd, and read faces. School could not compete with the tug of work and the urge to help at home. That choice set a course that would define him more than any diploma could. New Orleans in those years was a city of corners and cliques, wards and parishes, a place where public life and private arrangements often overlapped. The city carried layers of cultures and languages, and it rewarded people who could bargain, soothe, and insist. It also offered temptations. Young men who knew how to hustle could make quick money at the edge of the law. Street fights, petty theft, and small-time schemes brought early attention from police. Records from that period point to arrests in his youth and a growing familiarity with courtrooms. Nothing about this path was glamorous. It was rough, practical, and rooted in the need to earn. By the late 1930s, he had moved beyond the produce stand. He found opportunity in the gray zones that many cities tolerated at the time. Slot machines, pinball, and jukeboxes paid if they were placed in bars and cafes. Someone had to supply the machines, share the take, and smooth any trouble. He learned that route work collecting coins, keeping machines running, and placing them where they drew the most play could be turned into a business. He saw that small streams of cash, gathered in many places, became a river. He also learned that local officials could make life easy or hard, and that it was smart to keep conversations short and favors clear. The record shows an early conviction in 1938 for a marijuana offense. He served time and paid a fine. That case sits in the official files as a marker, the point at which his name entered the system in a way that did not fade. After his release, he returned to the same realm he knew best, only more carefully. He settled into a role that blended entrepreneur and fixer. He had brothers and cousins, and family ties became work ties. A route of machines turned into a network. Legal businesses, trucking, vending, a share in retail helped mask the profits that came from less open channels. He kept a small public profile and a firm private hand. World War II brought troops, paychecks, and a hunger for entertainment. Along the Gulf Coast, the demand for music, drinks, and games soared. In the parishes outside New Orleans, towns tolerated clubs that ran dice and card tables discreetly or, at times, openly. These places did not operate in a vacuum. They needed suppliers, security, and protection from raids. They also needed someone to balance the many interests at play. He fit that role. He spoke quietly, spread money where it mattered, and pulled back fast when heat rose. It was not one grand plan. It was the daily work of keeping a moving system balanced. New Orleans already had a history of organized rackets. Older figures had carved out districts and partnered with national gamblers long before he reached the top. One of those men, Silvestro Carollo, widely known as Silver Dollar Sam, had dominated the city's underworld through the 1930s. When deportations and pressure weakened that old guard in the 1940s, space opened at the top. Little by little, he took more of that space. By the late 1940s, law enforcement in Louisiana and federal agencies widely described him as the head of the New Orleans crime family. The title did not come with a ceremony. It came with responsibilities, risks, and an ever-growing list of people to keep steady. He dealt with gamblers who ran plush clubs on the edge of the city, with partners who had ties to New York and Las Vegas, and with parish officials who controlled licenses and police priorities. The famous Beverly Club in Jefferson Parish, for example, drew high-spending patrons and steady attention from both reporters and investigators. National gambling figures such as Frank Costello and Phil Castell had long cultivated networks in the city, and his path crossed theirs in arrangements that shared profits and burdens. He learned to handle disputes without noise, to accept losses when the cost of a fight was too high, and to withdraw before a storm. The system thrived on predictability as much as on excitement, and he understood that. His influence did not come from speeches or displays. It came from routine. Trucks moved, envelopes moved, machines were serviced, doors opened on time, workers got paid. This disciplined approach made the network resilient. When a grand jury was seated or a new sheriff took an office, he adjusted. He knew that the most dangerous moment for such a system was not a raid, but a vacuum. He tried to make sure there was never a vacuum. To the public, he presented as a businessman who preferred quiet. To the police, he presented as a figure who rarely left many fingerprints. To people inside the rackets, he presented as someone who could deliver stability. The early 1950s brought a new kind of spotlight. The U.S. Senate's Kefauver Committee toured the country to examine organized crime. Its hearings were broadcast and heavily covered. In New Orleans, the committee summoned local gamblers, club owners, and the man they called the city's underworld boss. He appeared and refused to incriminate himself, invoking his constitutional rights. The image of him on that witness stand, guarded and firm, traveled beyond Louisiana. It did not convict him of anything. It did, however, fix his name in the national discussion about racketeering. After that, federal attention remained steady. Back home, his daily work continued. Illegal gambling remained the core. Bookmaking on sports, backroom card games, and slot routes brought in steady money. Investigators said he took a cut from these operations through a mix of partnership and pressure. They described a system in which independent operators paid for the right to work and for help when problems arose. At the same time, he and his circle invested in land and legitimate businesses across Jefferson, Orleans, and St. Bernard parishes. That spread brought balance. When scrutiny grew intense on one area, income from another could carry the load. The line between clean and dirty money blurred by design. Local politics mattered as much as any single enterprise. Parishes in and around New Orleans had their own strongmen, and each of them had preferences on what should be open, what should be closed, and who should benefit. He learned how to fit his interests into those arrangements. Public corruption became part of the story. Law enforcement, grand juries, and journalists documented cases in which officers and officials took bribes to ignore or even protect illegal gambling. In those accounts, his name was a recurring presence. Charges did not always stick, but the pattern was there for anyone who looked. When a sheriff changed his tune, a club might shut down. When a judge ruled one way, a case vanished. When the music stopped in one spot, it picked up in another. He aimed to keep distance from narcotics. At least, that was the public posture. He told people around him that drug trafficking brought a level of federal attention that would threaten everything else. Agents, however, suspected that some members of his network, and perhaps his family, engaged in drug deals despite that stance. Those suspicions led to investigations and informant reports, but direct, durable proof tying him personally to a large-scale narcotics racket remained elusive in the years we are covering here. What is clear from the record is that illegal gambling and public corruption were the pillars of his influence. That is where raids, indictments, and testimony most often landed. The middle of the 1950s showed both the scope and the fragility of his reach. Clubs were raided, machines were seized, witnesses were flipped. He faced charges tied to gambling and conspiracy, and he fought them with skilled lawyers. Some cases ended with fines, others with dismissals. Now and then, a conviction landed. None of it put him out of business. The network adapted. A crew that ran a club one year might switch to a vending company the next. A manager who drew too much attention might be replaced. The goal was not to be invisible. The goal was to be durable. He kept his profile low in personal life. He married, raised children, and bought property in suburban areas where neighbors valued quiet. People who dealt with him described a man who spoke softly, listened more than he talked, and expected loyalty. Those who crossed him, according to police and prosecutors, found that permits could vanish, suppliers could dry up, or a summons could arrive at just the wrong time. There is no need to dramatize this. It was a world where control was expressed through access, timing, and money. Violence existed in the background of many rackets of that era, but the record for this period connects him far more clearly to economic pressure and corruption than to direct physical harm. National organized crime suffered a shock in 1957 with the Appalachian Meeting raid in upstate New York. While he was not among those caught there, the aftermath created waves that reached the Gulf. Police across the country targeted known figures more aggressively. The label of organized crime hardened into a framework that agencies used to coordinate investigations. In that climate, his refusal to flaunt power served him well. He did not seek headlines. He preferred handshakes in offices, contracts with friendly faces, and a web of small businesses that looked ordinary on paper. As the decade turned, he faced the most dramatic challenge of his career. The federal government re-examined his citizenship and immigration status. Born in North Africa to Sicilian parents and brought to the United States as a child, he had lived in Louisiana almost his entire life, but the paper trail around his entry and status became the basis for a push to remove him from the country. In 1961, amid a broader campaign against organized crime led by the new Attorney General, federal agents seized him and put him on a plane. He was taken to Guatemala under a theory that he had claimed a connection there. He did not stay away long. Through methods that were never fully clarified in public records, he returned to the United States. Courts later ruled parts of the deportation effort improper, and a long legal battle over his status unfolded. What matters for our purposes is that he kept his base in the New Orleans area and continued to be treated by authorities as the central figure in the city's rackets. By the early 1960s, he had survived the Senate spotlight, weathered a major deportation attempt, and maintained a grip on the region's illegal gambling. His name was now inseparable from the idea of the New Orleans family. The network he controlled was not a cartoon. It was a complicated blend of cash businesses, political connections, and quiet threats. People who paid him did so because he offered predictability in a trade that thrived on uncertainty. People who investigated him kept going because they believed that predictability rested on bribery and control that bent public institutions away from their duties. If you are listening as the night deepens, hold on to the rhythm of these facts. A boy from a market stall led a network that reached through clubs and parishes, from jukebox routes to casino floors that never advertised. Courts and committees named him central to that system. He was charged, fined, and sometimes convicted in matters tied to gambling and corruption. He avoided the kind of spectacular collapse that ended other careers, not because he was invincible, but because he moved carefully, adjusted constantly, and kept his circle tight. The story will continue through the years when national politics sharpened the pressure, when new undercover operations landed, and when courtrooms finally delivered heavier sentences. For now, let the hum of the city grow faint, and rest with the map of his rise drawn clearly in your mind. By the start of the 1960s, pressure from Washington reached New Orleans like a storm that would not blow out. The removal attempt in 1961 was the sharpest gust. Federal agents walked him from an office, put him on a plane, and left him in Guatemala under a theory built on paperwork he had once used. Within months, he was back in Louisiana, moving through parishes he knew as well as his own kitchen. Lawyers challenged the government's method, and courts later ruled the action improper. The legal fight took years, but the practical result was simple. He stayed where his business and family were, and the network adjusted to the new era of scrutiny. He kept a base at a spread of land on the west bank of Jefferson Parish, a tract locals called Churchill Farms. It looked like any large piece of country property: drainage canals, pasture, a low office, citrus trees on the edges. Visitors saw a modest building with a desk, a calendar, and a phone that rang often but never long. Men arrived, spoke softly, left. Contracts were signed for trucking, vending, and construction. Rents were collected. The public could drive past and see only a farm. Those who did business there understood that decisions made in that office rippled outward through bars, pool halls, amusement routes, and warehouses. The revenue formula evolved. Slots had been pushed out by state law in earlier crackdowns, so the focus shifted to backroom betting, private dice games, and amusement routes that skirted rules. Enforcement rose and fell with elections. When sheriffs who wanted clean books came in, houses closed and card rooms emptied. When officials chose cooperation, games revived under quieter terms. Envelopes moved, and favors were kept in balance. Investigators and reporters traced those patterns across Orleans, Jefferson, Street Bernard, and Plaquemines parishes. In their accounts, Carlos appeared as the steady hand behind concessions and access, rarely on the permit, often near the money. National gamblers still watched New Orleans. In the prior decade, Frank Costello and Phil Castell had built big rooms on the parish line, drawing crowds with music, food, and easy play. That period faded, especially after Castell's death in 1962, but the habits remained. Traveling bookmakers and local route men kept phone wires busy. The end of Havana as a gambling capital after the Cuban Revolution shifted attention across the Gulf. Tampa's Santos Traficante Jr. maintained contacts in New Orleans, and visiting figures from Chicago and New York passed through for meetings in hotels and restaurants. The city's port, rail lines, and air routes made it a natural crossroads. Carlos managed those relationships with care, trading predictability for introductions and a share of action. Immigration issues did not disappear. Officials pressed perjury counts over statements about birthplace and entry. Those cases joined a tangle that rose and fell through the decade. Some were dismissed, others ended in fines. A few produced short stints in federal custody. One episode in the mid-1960s drew unusual attention. An altercation with a federal agent that led to an assault conviction. The sentence was not long, but it showed the constant friction that surveillance produced. Courtroom scenes again presented the same image: a compact, reserved man at counsel table, while his lawyers argued points of law and procedure. These were also the years when his name brushed against the era's largest headline. After the assassination of President John F. Kennedy in 1963, speculation about motives and conspiracies circulated in cities where organized gamblers held influence. Some investigators, journalists, and later congressional inquiries examined whether any crime boss might have sought revenge against federal pressure, especially under attorney General Robert F. Kennedy, who had made high-profile targets of men like Carlos. New Orleans District Attorney Jim Garrison pulled local figures into his wide-ranging probe, mentioned Carlos in public comments, and pursued lines that drew people from bars, airfields, and back offices into the spotlight. Hearings in the 1970s by the Church Committee and the House Select Committee on Assassinations reviewed informant reports and rumors about him. They found motive and opportunity plausible for several figures, but stopped short of proof. He was never charged in that matter. He answered questions when compelled and invoked his rights when counsel advised. The topic remained a cloud of allegation, not a judgment. Day to day, the organization aimed to keep a low pulse. Jefferson Parish became a center of gravity, with a reliable flow from vending, amusement, and protection arrangements. Independent bookmakers paid for coverage that reduced interruption. Club operators paid to avoid abrupt visits from officers looking to make a splash. Those payments did not always prevent raids, because turnout in politics sometimes demanded a show. Still, most months, cash came in on schedule. He invested in land, small finance companies, and businesses that looked ordinary. He paid taxes on declared income, fought assessments on other holdings, and retained accountants who kept numbers consistent. It was a long game built on patience and repetition. Lawmen responded with new methods. Wiretaps and microphones appeared in cars, restaurants, and offices. Informants wore recorders. Agents followed trucks they believed carried root cash. Grand juries heard from bar owners seeking a way out, from disgruntled partners, and from deputies looking for immunity. Some voices supplied details that matched what police suspected. Others exaggerated, and a few invented stories. One challenge for prosecutors was turning that mass of talk into cases that could survive cross-examination. The best results came when they could combine tapes, ledgers, and a witness who could map the flow of money. Even then, defense lawyers pressed on chain-of-custody problems, faulty warrants, and credibility gaps. Trials often ended with split verdicts that proved wrongdoing in principle, but did not dismantle the structure. Through the late 1960s and into the 1970s, Carlos aged into a role that looked almost administrative. He delegated more, used couriers for messages, and avoided phones when possible. Meetings took place during walks on the farm, rides along levees, and breakfasts at the same tables he had used for years. Younger associates handled day-to-day matters with bookmakers, truck routes, and vending contracts. Older lieutenants stayed close to parish politics, maintaining relationships with officials who could steer permits, inspections, and enforcement. When a club went too far and drew heavy press, he let it close and opened another in a less visible spot. When a deputy demanded a higher fee for looking away, a manager would test the market in the next parish. Movement was the valve that released pressure. Even with caution, the 1970s brought heavier cases. Federal statutes had changed. The Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, known as RICO, allowed prosecutors to connect patterns of bribery, extortion, and illegal gambling into a single charge. It also let them label a business as an enterprise used to carry out crimes. Agents focused on his phone calls, travel, and meetings with union contacts, brokers, and public officials. The picture they tried to draw was not of cinematic scenes, but of a steady purchase of influence that warped the market and the public interest. Defense counsel countered that he ran legitimate companies and that any conversations about contracts were simply the talk of business people seeking opportunities in a state where politics touched everything. An undercover operation at the end of the decade shifted the field. The FBI used a skilled swindler, working with agents to pose as insurance brokers, who could place large policies for public workers. Recordings captured discussions about helping this supposed company win state business in exchange for payments and political help. Those conversations involved well-known figures in Baton Rouge and New Orleans. Carlos appeared on tapes being cautious, asking who vouched for whom, and suggesting ways to route favors through intermediaries. Prosecutors framed that caution as experienced corruption. The defense framed it as a man indulging a talkative visitor without committing to anything. Indictments followed in 1980, and a sweeping trial arrived soon after. The courtroom was patient but relentless. Jurors heard weeks of testimony, played hours of audio, and saw charts showing lines between businessmen, labor officials, and state officers. Witnesses who had taken part in the sting explained code words and relationships. Defense lawyers picked at each step, attacked the credibility of the cooperating witness, and argued that the government had built a case out of approach and suggestion rather than firm acts. The verdicts cut through that debate. Carlos was convicted on serious counts tied to racketeering and conspiracy. He received a long federal sentence and a fine. Appeals chipped at pieces of the outcome but left the core in place. When he went to prison in the early 1980s, it marked the first time in his adult life that he was truly removed from daily contact with his network. The effect on the organization was mixed. Some parts continued with little change, run by brothers and trusted aides who had watched him for years. Other parts faltered under the weight of closer scrutiny and the loss of daily coordination. A few associates tried to seize control and drew more attention by fighting over shares. Outside groups tested old boundaries and sometimes pushed into markets that had once been his alone. Law enforcement pressed the moment, urging defendants who had kept quiet for decades to cooperate. The result was not a collapse, but a steady erosion. The edge he had held through careful timing dulled when he was away. Inside, age worked as hard as the sentence did. Reports from that period describe a man who held to routine, took slow walks in the yard, and met regularly with lawyers. There were claims that he talked more freely with cellmates about old business than he ever had with outsiders. One inmate later told the FBI that Carlos had taken credit for crimes far beyond gambling and corruption, including the biggest political killing of the century. Those claims, like so many before them, were impossible to verify fully and were contested by people who knew him. Officials weighed them and moved on. The record remains the same. Heavy suspicion on the biggest questions, no formal charges on those matters. What did endure was the long ledger on gambling and corruption. From the market stall to the farm office, he had built a machine that paid, month after month, because it linked neighborhood businesses to parish offices and promised calm. That calm came at a civic cost. Honest competitors were pushed out. Police work was bent away from the law. Public money was steered by private understandings. The legal cases in the 1970s and early 1980s, especially the undercover sting that ended with his RICO conviction, spelled that out in exhibits and testimony. When he left court for prison, the lesson was plain to anyone who had watched the arc. Slow methods can grind down even the most careful network. He would return home after years, older, quieter, and no longer the daily presence he had been. Others filled the spaces he left, some with less restraint, some with more interest in quick grabs than in systems that last. By then, the city had changed as well. Tourism grew. New businesses brought different money. Enforcement tools improved. There were still bets placed in back rooms and money skimmed from routes, but the shape of that world no longer depended on one man's availability. The story of his climb had become a record of what institutions had allowed, what investigators had built, and what juries had finally decided. He came home from federal custody older than the photos that had run for years, with a slower gait and the same quiet eyes. Time had pressed down on him, and yet the old rhythms were visible. The house was modest for someone who had been called a boss for decades. Friends stopped by early in the day. Family arrived in the evening. Meals were simple, conversation low, and the door was rarely left open long. Reporters watched from a distance, hoping for a line or a glance. He did not oblige. Lawyers managed the remaining appeals and conditions. Doctors checked on him. The world he had shaped no longer needed him moment by moment, but his name still made people lower their voices. To see that stretch clearly, it helps to look again at the working parts that had kept his enterprise moving for so long. Illegal gambling was the core. Bookmakers took wagers on football, boxing, and the horses. Card rooms ran steady games in back rooms or in private houses that paid for quiet. Amusement and vending routes brought coins from jukeboxes, pinball, and machines that were carefully calibrated to stay just this side of whatever rule was being enforced that month. Each of those lanes produced cash, and each depended on a web of understandings with local authorities. Those understandings took many forms: campaign help, retainer contracts, promises of jobs for friends, envelopes that met the price of cooperation. Investigators later called that corruption. Indictments and trials stated the same thing in legal language: bribery, conspiracy, extortion, obstruction. He did not invent the setup in New Orleans. The city had tolerated rackets since long before his rise, but he organized them with a steadiness that made the cash streams reliable. A club could operate for months without incident. A route could run for years with few seizures. When a sheriff changed policy, an operator might find a new location on the other side of a parish line. That patience made the system look almost normal. Bank deposits from small businesses mixed with cash from private games. Some of that money went into land and companies that filed routine paperwork. The line between legal and illegal was blurred by design, and he kept that blur in place by staying out of the spotlight and avoiding flamboyance. In the 1950s, the glamour rooms at the edge of Jefferson Parish drew crowds and attention. The Beverly Club became a symbol of that era, with fine dining, music, and tables that stayed busy. National figures with histories in New York and Las Vegas came and went, partnering with local managers who knew what the parish would accept. Phil Castell had been a major presence. Frank Costello's name floated around the arrangements. Those ties were not run with press releases. They were managed with visits, quiet shares, and careful division of risk. When that phase ended, roots and private betting stayed. He was consistent through both periods. Avoid noise, deliver predictability, and make sure anyone who profited under his umbrella understood the price of protection. The Kefauver hearings at the start of that decade gave the country a close look at people who had previously been names on police lists. When he sat before that committee, he used his right not to incriminate himself. He answered basic identity questions and declined to engage on substance. Viewers saw a reserved man who treated the process as a battle of patience. In the aftermath, raids increased for a while, and machines disappeared from some rooms. Then, as elections came and went, the old patterns resumed. He adjusted to the new scrutiny by delegating more tasks and by tightening the circle around the farm office that had become the nerve center of his business life. That office, set among ditches and citrus on the West Bank, offered discretion. People could arrive without attracting notice. One door in, one door out. Coffee on a side table, a calendar with penciled initials instead of names. He used short meetings and simple rules. Bring a solution, know the line of authority, and leave with clear next steps. He preferred contracts when possible, even for arrangements that investigators later said were covers for payoffs. A legitimate invoice gave everyone something to point to if asked. If a deputy wanted to be put on a payroll for consulting, a company could do that. If a permit needed to move, a contributor list could be updated. If a vendor wanted access to a school board or a state office, an introduction could be arranged through an intermediary who understood how to talk without saying too much. The deportation drama in 1961 exposed how deeply his life had rooted in Louisiana. The push came from Washington under a new attorney general, determined to show that the federal government would confront organized rackets. Agents took him into custody, moved him out of the country on an argument about nationality, and left him in Guatemala after quick flights and sparse notices. Within months, he was back. Whether by bribes, forged papers, or help from contacts, the record never nailed down. Lawyers attacked the legal basis for the removal, and courts later ruled parts of the process improper. For years after, he fought off perjury counts and immigration charges spun from that episode. Some cases were dismissed. Others produced fines or short terms. None broke his base. The 1960s tied his name to events that still invite speculation. After the assassination of President Kennedy, local and federal investigators pulled at every thread connecting Dallas, New Orleans, Miami, and Havana. They noted that he had been a target of the administration's crime campaign. They noted that Lee Harvey Oswald had New Orleans roots, and that Jack Ruby had visited the city in the past. Rumors multiplied. Informants offered contradictory stories. Congressional inquiries a decade later studied those reports carefully. They recorded that some claims suggested motive and capability among several figures in the national underworld, but that proof was lacking. He was never charged in that matter. He met questions with silence or legal formulas, and the subject remained in the realm of allegation, not settled fact. Closer to home, the cases that stuck were about money and influence. When a pinball operator refused to pay, machines might disappear during an inspection. When a club drew too much press, its owner might find the lease canceled, or the vendors suddenly unresponsive. Those actions sent messages without spectacle. Police reports from the period include episodes of threats and occasional beatings in the wider network. But the documented pattern that touched him most clearly was economic pressure and bribery. Prosecutors used those patterns to build grand jury records, and eventually they used new federal tools to set out the idea of an enterprise run through legitimate fronts for illegitimate ends. The 1970s brought the statute that changed the landscape. RICO. Instead of treating each bribe or payoff as a separate offense, prosecutors could show a pattern tied to an organization and sweep it into a conspiracy that pointed at leadership. That approach fit his world, where a vending company, a finance office, and a farm could be part of one operation. Agents followed money through shells and partners. They taped calls that mixed small talk with hints about public contracts. They cultivated a swindler-turned-cooperator who could pose as a broker, offering fat insurance premiums for public employees. Those tapes, made during what officials called an undercover project to clean up bribery in labor and government insurance, captured people around him discussing ways to steer deals and reward helpers. He was heard measuring risk, asking who vouched for the visitors, and suggesting layers that would keep names off the first line of any ledger. Indictments landed in 1980. The trial that followed filled weeks with audio, transcripts, and charts. Witnesses described introductions, lunches, and rides where promises were sketched. The defense insisted that the government had invented a crime by sending smooth talkers to tempt politicians and businessmen into hypotheticals. Jurors disagreed. They returned guilty verdicts on racketeering and conspiracy counts. He received a substantial sentence. Appeals trimmed edges but left the structure standing. For the first time, he was absent from his network for a long period. That absence marked a turning point. Younger men took on tasks they had once watched others perform. Some proved careful. Others chased quick money and drew heat. In those years away, stories circulated about his conversations with cellmates. Some said he talked about episodes from the old days, giving himself a larger role than investigators had ever proved. Authorities listened to those tales and weighed them against the record. They remained just that, tales. The convictions that mattered were still for the conduct that had been documented again and again. The long-running effort to control illegal gambling, to corrupt public functions, and to use businesses to channel both money and influence. When release finally came, it was conditioned by age and health. He returned to a smaller orbit. Back in Jefferson Parish, his life narrowed to family and a few familiar faces. A car would arrive in the morning. He would ride past the farm, look at the water levels in the canals, glance at the citrus, and nod to workers he had known for years. He ate simple meals at home or in quiet restaurants. He kept visits short and schedules steady. He left phones to others. Whether by decision or by necessity, his voice no longer drove the daily routine. Local law enforcement had changed too, with newer leaders who had made their reputations on promising cleaner practice. They did not erase old habits overnight, but they introduced uncertainty into the old trades. Raids could come without warning. Some operators gave up routes that had once seemed like permanent property. The press, which had spent decades chasing him, adjusted as well. Long-form features looked back at the saga and tried to find the lesson. Some emphasized endurance. How a man with limited formal education had outlasted prosecutors again and again, until new tools finally lowered the boom. Others emphasized civic cost. How years of payoffs had warped the region's politics and hurt small businesses that tried to play by the rules. Still others tried to untangle the web of rumor linking him to events far beyond Louisiana. In those pieces, you can feel a tension between the urge to explain everything and the reality that some questions do not have neat answers. What remains clear across the documents is the body of conduct that law and testimony established. He rose from street hustles to a position where he directed illegal betting across multiple parishes. He used bribery and pressure to shield that trade. He built legitimate firms to provide cover and to launder proceeds. He cultivated relationships with figures in law enforcement and politics who could influence arrests, permits, and contracts. He used caution, not showmanship, as a method. He kept violence distant from his own hands in the public record, letting money do what fists would have done in a cruder system. He endured the 1950s Senate spotlight, survived a dramatic deportation try, parried a decade of immigration and perjury fights, and finally fell to an undercover project that stitched many small dealings into one coherent case. As night gets deeper and your breath slows, hold this picture. A man shaped by a market stall learned how to make dozens of small streams flow toward him. He called that business. The state called much of it crime. Juries agreed when they were finally given a frame that showed how the pieces connected. After he served his time, he returned to the same landscape, still loyal to familiar roads, still choosing quiet, but no longer the hinge on which the region's hidden economy turned. The city kept moving. New players learned old lessons. Investigators refined their craft. And on a shaded property beyond the levee, a figure who had once balanced every lever of a system spent his days with family, the low talk of visitors, and the steady hum of a place that had anchored his life. The years after prison reshaped the edges of his world. He woke early, kept a steady routine, and surrounded himself with family and a tight circle of old associates who knew how to speak in shorthand. He had earned a reputation for patience, and age only deepened that trait. On most days, he stayed close to home in Jefferson Parish, with short trips past the levee and the fields that had anchored his business identity for decades. Neighbors saw a reserved elder who waved politely and moved on. Reporters still tried to guess which visitors mattered. He did not give them more than a glimpse. Appeals from the earlier convictions had run their course by then. Lawyers pressed technical points, argued about tapes and warrants, and won small rulings that trimmed around the edges. The main result stood: the undercover case that linked bribery, public contracts, and union benefits held together on review. He had been found guilty of taking part in a scheme that promised access in exchange for money and political help. The label attached by prosecutors, racketeering, summed up what investigators believed he had managed. Not a single deal, but a pattern of using businesses and influence to steady an illegal market. The sentence had taken years from him in a way that earlier fines and short terms had not. After release, health and supervision limited his pace. Still, he retained social gravity. People made time to see him. even if only to pay respect. To understand those last working years, it helps to look closely at the staples of his operation as documented over time. Bookmaking was the backbone. Agents who chased the network mapped how bets flowed in on football weekends and horse racing days, with runners taking calls and passing numbers to larger layoff sheets that balanced risk across parishes. The network favored predictability, the same phone lines, the same pickup times, the same cut for the house. Informants told grand juries that independent bookmakers paid for the right to run without sudden raids and for help collecting debts that did not respond to polite reminders. Those arrangements made returns steady for everyone up the line. Amusement and vending routes formed the other pillar. Jukeboxes, pinball, and machines with payout features sometimes fully legal, often engineered to skirt rules, were placed in bars, lounges, and corner groceries. Owners split the take with the route company. Investigators described how a route tied to his circle could make life easy for a cooperative bar and uncomfortable for a rival. A compliance visit might result in a sudden change of heart by a landlord, or a permit office might discover an overlooked form. None of this was dramatic in the cinematic sense. It was slow pressure, documented in raids, seizures, and statements by business owners who eventually chose to speak. The public side of his operation grew from those cash lines. Real estate holdings stabilized income. Small finance companies extended short-term loans to operators and gamblers, with interest that climbed fast when payments slipped. Investigators called that loan sharking. He and his lawyers called it credit in a high-risk market. In court, the vocabulary mattered less than the pattern. Witnesses described envelopes, collection schedules, and a clear understanding that missing payments would trigger problems no one wanted. Again, the record linking him to direct harm is thin compared to the massive evidence on bribery and business pressure. The habits of control did not rely on spectacle, they relied on access. That access required cooperation from people in public roles. Parish-level offices controlled zoning, licensing, inspections, and the day-to-day friction points that could make or break a club or a route. At the state level, contracts for insurance and benefits offered large, predictable streams of money. The undercover case that led to his principal conviction in the 1980s built on those facts. Agents placed a seasoned con man in the role of an insurance broker who claimed he could deliver coverage for public workers. The broker offered fees, political help, and goodwill to the right officials and intermediaries. Recordings captured discussions about who could move what, which introductions mattered, and how to structure payments to avoid direct exposure. He appeared in those conversations as the wary veteran, asking who stood behind the new faces and suggesting buffers. Prosecutors argued that this was how a careful boss arranged corruption. Defense lawyers said it was talk and nothing more. The jury accepted the government's reading. Long before that sting, he had practiced a method that made cases hard to assemble. He preferred a small staff, short meetings, and routine disguised as normal business. A calendar carried initials, not names. He used companies for cover. A vending outfit here, a farm, an office there, a real estate subsidiary, a layer beyond that. When investigators followed the money, they found it bled into land purchases, leases, and mortgages that looked ordinary on paper. Bankers saw consistent payments and tax returns that matched declared income. Cash that came from back rooms and phones disappeared into the flow. Detectives who worked the beat for years learned to recognize the signs, but turning recognition into proof took time and coordination across agencies. Until federal statutes changed, that gap favored him. The older cases in his record show the same pattern at smaller scale. In the 1940s and early 1950s, slot machines and dice games were the hot items. He placed machines through companies tied to his circle, split revenue with owners, and used partners who had long histories in the city's nightlife. When state crackdowns removed slots, pinball and jukeboxes filled the gap. He bought trucks, set up service teams, and made sure the routes ran without interruption. The most visible nodes were the glamorous clubs near parish lines in the mid-century years. Those rooms drew national gamblers and national attention. When that era closed, the backroom and route economy remained and kept paying. He managed the transition by shedding flash and relying on steady money that drew less press. He also adapted to the national waves that rolled through the 1950s and 1960s. The Kefauver hearings brought an early burst of televised scrutiny. He met that moment with silence and patience. The deportation drama in 1961 was the opposite, sudden and stunning. Taken out of the country on short notice, he returned and fought the legal ground under the government's feet. Later cases accused him of lying about entry and nationality, and one mid-1960s episode produced a conviction for assaulting a federal agent during a confrontation. That sentence was short, but it showed how friction at the margins of constant surveillance could spill into court. Each event added to the public file without pulling him out of place for long. The big break came only when new tools allowed prosecutors to treat all the small parts as one scheme. The cloud that blew in after 1963 never fully left either. Investigators and authors suggested many possible threads tying organized crime figures to the events in Dallas. His name appeared in that conversation because of motive attributed to pressure from Washington and because of New Orleans' links to several characters who crossed that story. Congressional committees in the 1970s reviewed reports, heard from informants, and weighed the claims. They did not find proof that could become a charge. He was never indicted in that matter. He answered limited questions when required, and otherwise declined to amplify speculation. The boundary between rumor and record stayed firm. After release in the late 1980s, he re-entered a landscape that had shifted. Law enforcement had more wiretaps, more interagency teams, and more experience with long conspiracy cases. At the same time, the state moved to legalize certain forms of gaming in regulated venues, which changed the market that his world had long supplied. Video poker and riverboat casinos would come into play in the years after his active period ended, but the trend line was visible. The old web of backrooms and envelopes lost some of its footing as legal channels emerged for the wagers that had once funded his network. Younger operators who had learned under him either adapted to new rules or tried to run the old playbook and found the ground different. Health narrowed his path more than any legal shift. He aged into quiet. People who visited described a man who still listened closely but spoke little. A creature of habit, who preferred familiar rooms and faces. He had married and raised children, and that family base was stronger than any business tie at the end. The name that had once traveled across state lines, now attached to a grandfather who appeared at gatherings for a short time and left before the crowd grew loud. Photographers caught him a handful of times leaving a restaurant or riding in a car. The jaw was the same. The energy was not. He died in the early 1990s, and the funeral matched the rest of his public life. Brief, controlled, and closed to spectacle. What the record leaves behind is a map of how influence worked in a particular place and time. It shows a man born Calogero, later known as Carlos, who arrived as a child from the Mediterranean, left school early, and learned to turn small transactions into a living. It shows early arrests and a 1938 narcotics conviction that put his name in federal files. It shows a climb through amusement routes and gambling partnerships to a role at the center of New Orleans' underworld by the late 1940s. It shows how he held that place for decades by emphasizing cash-based businesses, political connections, and pressure applied without fireworks. It shows repeated allegations about narcotics that he denied and that prosecutors did not convert into charges against him personally at scale. It shows proven cases of bribery, conspiracy, and racketeering that finally placed him in federal custody for a long span. It shows a return to the same parishes, an old farm office, and a smaller orbit. The harm recorded alongside that map is civic rather than cinematic. Legal businesses that refused to pay found themselves pushed aside. Public offices meant to serve the wider good answered at times to private deals. Officers who took envelopes betrayed the badge, and cases that should have been brought were not. The slow, steady money that sustained his operation did not arrive by chance. It was built by bending rules day after day, year after year, until the bending looked normal. When prosecutors explained that to juries using the language of enterprise and pattern, the public finally saw how the pieces fit. Convictions followed, and a system that had seemed invulnerable gave way to age, law, and change in the market. He did not write a memoir or give a confessional interview that tied off every loose end. He left hints, court transcripts, and a trail of business documents that together tell a story without romance. In that story, a person who prized quiet built a noisy legend without trying. The legend does not need embellishment. The facts are enough. A youth in the French market, A climb through jukebox routes, alliances with national gamblers, televised refusals in a Senate hearing, a dramatic flight out of the country, and a more dramatic return, years of skirting and fighting charges, a sweeping undercover case that caught him, a decline marked by routine, and a death that closed the door on a long-running chapter of the city's underground economy. If you are resting with these details, let them settle as part of a broader lesson. Places teach people how to move. He learned from New Orleans that commerce, friendship, and power often wandered into each other's lanes. He used that insight to build a career that lasted far longer than most in his line of work. Law and time eventually closed the gap he had used. Others stepped in after, and the city turned to new kinds of business, new flavors of risk, and new fights over where the line should be. His part of the story remains a case study in persistence, and in the cost of tolerating what seems like only a little rule-bending when multiplied across years. To round out the picture, step back with me and look closely at how the city around him shaped what he did, and how he, in turn, shaped the city's habits. New Orleans was a port with long memories and short distances. The market taught quick math and face reading. The back rooms taught patience. In that setting, he turned small hustles into steady income. The first clear mark in official files was the 1,938 conviction for a marijuana offense. He served time, paid a fine, and came out with sharper caution. That early case matters because it shows how soon his life intersected with courtrooms, and because it established the name that would recur in government records for the next half-century. The late 1930s and 1940s gave him lanes that many cities tolerated in one form or another. Routes of slot machines, pinball, and jukeboxes made money 2 quarters at a time. Bars and corner groceries hosted the machines. Route men serviced them, split revenue, and kept everyone paid. When slots were pushed out by law, pinball and music boxes stayed. By adding private card games and dice to that base, he created a cash flow that did not depend on a single room. The real skill lay in spreading risk and building routine. Collections happened on the same day each week. Repairs happened fast. A new location replaced any room that went dark. This is not romance. It is logistics. Other men had paved parts of the road. Silver Dollar Sam Carollo was the towering figure in New Orleans rackets before the war. Deportations and pressure in the 1940s weakened Carollo's base, and the old system reorganized in stages. In that reshuffling, Carlos gained ground. He knew the routes, many of the owners, and the parish officials who controlled permits and policing. By the late 1940s, federal and local intelligence reports described him as first among equals in the city's underworld. That label came not from ceremony but from the accumulation of favors owed and decisions deferred to him. He did not waive the title. He simply worked as if everyone already understood. The public got a glimpse during the K-Fover committee hearings in 1951. Senators toured the country questioning gamblers, sheriffs, and businessmen whose names filled vice files. When he took the chair, he gave his name and little else, invoking the Fifth Amendment when questions moved toward substance. Broadcasts sent his image into homes, far from the Gulf. The committee did not prove a grand conspiracy in New Orleans, but it fixed a few simple facts for a wide audience: that organized gambling existed, that it relied on corrupt arrangements, and that a quiet man named Marcello had a central place in the system at that moment. Behind the scenes, he preferred an office that looked like any small business. The West Bank tract, later known as Churchill Farms, became his base. Citrus trees, canals, a modest building with a desk and a phone. Meetings were brief. Calendars carried initials. Paperwork moved through companies with ordinary names. A visitor might be listed as a consultant. A payoff might be dressed as a service contract. A favor might be explained as a lease adjustment. Investigators and the Metropolitan Crime Commission, a civic watchdog led for many years by Aaron Cohn, documented the pattern: a web of legitimate firms used as shields for payments that bought access, protection, and influence over enforcement priorities. Not every allegation became a charge, but the broad outline stayed consistent across raids, ledgers, and testimony. The flashiest rooms in his orbit belonged to an era that has since become legend. The Beverly Club and other plush spots near the Jefferson Parish line offered food, music, and gambling with a smile. National gamblers with ties to New York or Las Vegas appeared as partners or advisors. Phil Castell's presence became part of the lore. Frank Costello's name floated in the background. Those alliances brought both profits and attention. When crackdowns and deaths ended that phase, the economy did not collapse. The routes and private games he had nurtured kept paying. He had never put all his weight on a single door. That was the point. Politicians and parish offices formed the other necessary pillar. Licenses, zoning, inspections, and raids were tools that could open or close a room overnight. Campaign help, donations, and consulting contracts smoothed edges. Investigations over the decades documented bribery schemes that moved cash from route men and club owners to officers and officials. Some cases resulted in convictions for public employees. Others ended in resignations or discipline. In that universe, his name was the constant in background notes. He stayed a step away, used intermediaries, and argued that any payments tied to his businesses were for actual services. Prosecutors fought to turn patterns into proof. Defense lawyers forced them to meet exacting standards. The back and forth kept the system intact for a long time. He publicly rejected narcotics. He warned that drug cases brought heavy federal attention that could wreck everything. Agents remained convinced that some people within his circle touched that trade despite his line. Informants offered stories. Surveillance produced fragments. Yet major narcotics indictments that personally and directly tied him to large shipments did not land. The record that did land, again and again, grounded itself in gambling protection, bribery, and the use of front companies to move money and favors. That is where charges stuck, where juries agreed, and where sentences accumulated. One collision with the federal presence became a case of its own. In the mid-1960s, he was convicted of assaulting a federal agent during a heated encounter tied to ongoing surveillance. The term was short, but the moment captured how constant pressure could boil over. The larger immigration tangle from that era ran even longer. The dramatic 1961 removal to Guatemala, engineered by the Justice Department under Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy, sparked years of litigation. He returned quickly. Courts later found parts of the government's action improper. Perjury and false statement counts related to his entry and status chased him for years, with mixed results. Through it all, he kept his base and continued to be treated as the central figure in the city's rackets. The assassination of President Kennedy brought a decade of speculation that reached into his world. New Orleans' connections to characters who touched that story gave journalists and committees reasons to ask. District Attorney Jim Garrison invoked his name in public remarks while pursuing an ill-fated prosecution that the courts and most historians now regard as flawed. A generation later, congressional inquiries reviewed informant claims about multiple underworld figures. They assessed motive and opportunity, reported what they could, and stopped short of conclusions. He was never charged. The subject remained a tangle of claims, not a case. The real turning point arrived with the change in federal law and tactics. In the 1970s, conspiracy statutes broadened. RICO allowed prosecutors to present a pattern of acts: bribery, extortion, gambling tied to an enterprise and leadership. Undercover tools improved. The FBI built stings that offered a controlled way to document who asked for what and how money moved. One of those stings, known as a public corruption and labor insurance probe, put a skilled swindler to work as an informant. The tapes gathered in that project captured conversations about steering state insurance business, rewarding helpful officials, and insulating decision-makers. On those recordings, he sounded wary and experienced, drawing lines and asking for layers. Prosecutors argued that such caution showed seasoned control. Defense counsel said it proved he avoided commitment. A jury convicted him in 1981 of racketeering and conspiracy. He received a substantial sentence and fine. Appeals clipped at the edges but left the core intact. Prison altered his reach. Brothers and long-trusted aides kept some pieces moving. Other pieces stalled under closer watch. Outside groups pressed into spaces that had once been guarded by unspoken boundaries. The slow erosion that followed showed how much of his power had depended on constant tending. Without his daily hand on the levers, local operators made choices that drew heat. Law enforcement encouraged cooperation among people who had been silent for years. The result was not a dramatic collapse, but a steady loss of ground. After years inside, he returned to a smaller life. Age, Health and the changed landscape reduced his presence. He kept routines, family, and a few ties to the old farm office. The city around him evolved. Tourism grew. Legal gambling arrived in regulated forms. Sheriffs and prosecutors used tools that had not existed when he built his network. The same streets and canals were there, but the rules had shifted. He passed in 1993, and the obituary pages marked the end of a long, complicated career that had defined a chapter of Louisiana's underground economy. For a full measure of what he did, list the conduct the record supports. He ran illegal gambling across multiple parishes, took cuts from bookmakers, and protected card games and backroom play. He controlled amusement and vending routes that leveraged access and pressure. He invested cash proceeds through companies that handled real estate, financing, and leases. He bought cooperation from some public officials with money, favors, and jobs. He fought taxes and assessments, sometimes winning, sometimes not. He was convicted of a narcotics offense in 1938, an assault on a federal agent in the 1960s, and racketeering and conspiracy in the early 1980s after an undercover probe. He invoked constitutional rights during investigations and hearings, including before the Kefauver Committee. He was removed from the country in 1961 in a move later found improper and returned to fight the matter in court. He was suspected of more than he was ever charged with, and linked by rumor to the century's darkest headline without formal accusation. Through it all, he preferred understatement to flash. The civic cost sits plainly in the record. Businesses that tried to operate cleanly faced stacked decks. Officers paid to uphold the law accepted envelopes and favors, leaving neighborhoods less protected and trust weakened. When RICO allowed jurors to see all the small acts as one plan, the city got a clearer view of how much the bending of rules had cost over time. The verdicts that followed did not erase the past, but they did show that persistent, careful work could pierce a carefully kept distance. What remains is a case study in how a person, a city, and an era intersected. He learned from the market to keep accounts, from the parish line to respect timing, and from the Senate spotlight to minimize exposure. He used those lessons to build a durable machine that mixed business with corruption. Investigators, journalists, and reformers answered in waves, sometimes late, sometimes early, eventually with tools that fit the problem. His life did not unfold in movie scenes. It moved by inches, with envelopes, phone calls, leases, and meetings that ended before the coffee cooled. In that quiet, his influence grew, lasted, and finally ebbed when age and law overtook it. As you breathe more slowly, picture that breath. A child in a market, a reserved man behind a desk on a farm, a defendant hearing a jury foreman speak, and an elder who outlived the world he built. Age softened the edges of his posture, but not the way he listened. He had always preferred to let the other person talk first, to weigh a request before answering, to cut through chatter with a single instruction. That habit remained. Visitors adjusted to the quieter rhythm. They arrived with paperwork that looked clean, left with a nod, and understood that anything important would be relayed through a familiar intermediary. He had spent decades building a life where movement looked ordinary. That was his lasting method. Make unusual leverage appear as routine business. Keep records that read like any small firm's files, and avoid any stage where applause might tempt a slip. He had learned early that stability beats spectacle. Bookmaking paid when customers trusted that bets would be honored, and that collections would not bring chaos to a doorway. The crews who took wagers used fixed pickup times, steady lines, and a clear cut for the house. When a football season ended, horse racing and prize fights carried the action. When a popular team hit a hot streak, larger sheets absorbed the imbalance. The point was to smooth spikes so that no single weekend threatened the ledger. Agents who studied those operations wrote reports that mapped the pathways as if charting a river system. Tributaries fed larger streams and, finally, a reservoir where the money was counted and dispersed. The machines on the routes taught different lessons. They were public, heavy, and installed in rooms where owners worried first about staying open. Repairs had to be fast. Collections had to be discreet. Contracts had to give a bar or store just enough reason to say yes without inviting questions from neighbors. A jukebox that brought in a few extra dollars could tip the margin for a small place. A pinball game that flirted with payout features tempted customers while giving a proprietor something to point to if inspectors appeared. Root men were chosen as much for their manners as for their mechanical skill. A smile, a quick fix, and an envelope left under a counter kept the gears turning. Real estate provided ballast. Parcels near canals, storefronts on quiet blocks, and small warehouses gave cash somewhere to land. Those holdings appeared on county rolls with routine tax assessments and mortgages that made sense on paper. A finance company could lend to a club owner or a route operator, and, if needed, step in to take control of the lease when payments lagged. To an outsider, these transactions looked like the daily frictions of commerce. Investigators, with time and patience, saw how those frictions aligned with favors and with the absence of certain kinds of trouble. The picture did not rely on a single dramatic act. It relied on repetition. Across the decades, watchdogs tried to keep pace. The Metropolitan Crime Commission gathered tips, read court filings, and compared notes with detectives who had spent years on vice beats. Their reports explained what ordinary readers could not see from a single raid or arrest, that the same names appeared across different kinds of cases, that the same companies sat in the background of leases and consulting contracts, that the same patterns reappeared whenever a new sheriff promised a cleanup. These reports did not always produce charges. They did, however, give reformers and editors a language to describe the gap between law on paper and practice on the street. Public corruption was the hinge that made the rest swing. Parish offices controlled permits, inspections, and the priorities that determined whether a weekend ended with receipts counted in peace or with doors padlocked by officers seeking headlines. Campaign support, consulting arrangements, and introductions to donors formed the currency of that part of the system. People inside government did not always think of themselves as part of a scheme. Many considered what they took as the price of navigating a politicized workplace. The law used sharper words: bribery, conspiracy, and influence peddling. In the files that became public, his name often appeared at a slight distance from the handoff, attached instead to a company, a lease, or an intermediary. His caution about narcotics has been repeated by people who worked around him. Stay away from that trade because it draws the most relentless attention. Agents believed that others in his orbit ignored that rule. Some informants claimed pieces of larger stories, yet the major counts that would have tied him personally to drug shipments never took root in court. What did take root decade after decade were cases that described a marketplace organized around illicit gambling, protected by payments to public servants, and shielded by businesses that looked ordinary to anyone not tracing the money with a magnifying glass. The immigration saga sits in its own column. The 1,961 removal, run fast and with an edge that courts later judged improper, underscored how determined Washington had become to move against known racketeers. Dropped in Guatemala under paperwork that the government argued was valid, he found his way back and mounted a challenge that kept lawyers occupied for years. Along the path, he faced perjury and false statement counts tied to birthplace and entry, and at least one confrontation with a federal agent collapsed into a scuffle that produced an assault conviction. Each piece added to his file without altering his daily reach for long. He survived by treating every loss as a cost of doing business and by resuming the slow work of tending his network. National headlines swirled in the 1960s and 1970s, and his name brushed their edges. The killing of a president, the rise of televised congressional inquiries, and the exposure of meetings among underworld figures gave the public a vocabulary for things civic groups had been warning about for years. When committees and authors cataloged who might have had motive to strike at an administration that had pressed so hard against organized rackets, they listed familiar names. His was among them. Investigations wrote that down and moved on when proof did not clear the bar. He was never charged. The rumble remained a permanent footnote, not a verdict. The legal landscape changed decisively in the 1970s. RICO allowed prosecutors to connect acts that had previously been treated as isolated. Wiretaps and body recorders improved. Agents grew more adept at building cases patiently, with an eye toward how defense lawyers would attack gaps. The undercover project that led to his heaviest sentence was born from that shift. An informant with a talent for ingratiating himself was presented as a broker who could help place insurance for public employees. The proposition dangled easy money for those in position to steer contracts. Tapes captured the hemming and hawing that such offers produce among cautious participants. Who vouches for you? How far can you carry this without names appearing on paper? What is the cleanest cover story, if someone asks after the fact? Prosecutors said those recordings showed a leader guiding a corrupt exchange. The jury agreed. Prison was a lesson in limits. A network built on daily contact cannot run forever at a distance. Some parts continued because they relied on people who had already been making most of the calls. Other parts sagged because they had depended on the quiet authority that came from his presence. It is not romantic to say that a machine needs its mechanic. It is simply the truth for operations that run on trust. Without him in the chair at the farm office, disputes that he would have settled in a 5-minute conversation stretched into arguments that bled money and drew attention. Law enforcement, for its part, pressed the moment. Officers who had watched the same doors for years found that a few words from an exhausted defendant opened paths they had never been able to travel before. When he returned, he found a different game. The rise of regulated gaming shifted some wagers into legal rooms with cameras, licenses, and audits. That did not erase underground betting, but it did change its shape and margins. Younger figures were less patient. They took risks with phones and cars that older men would have avoided. Public offices recruited differently, and the generation of officials who had grown up inside the old favor system began to retire. Reformers, some inspired by the very hearings that had once seemed like only noise, entered office with promises to clean up parish contracts and to rotate assignments so that deputies did not spend whole careers looking at the same corners. His personal world shrank as the public world moved. The farm remained a symbol. He still visited. He still listened more than he spoke. He still kept his answers brief. A family member would drive. Coffee would be poured. A short walk along a canal would suffice for a meeting. Whatever messages needed sending would go out through a familiar voice, never by phone, never with drama. Even when his health reduced those outings, people around him held to the old form, as if ritual itself could slow the pace of change. Reflecting on the full sweep, you see a pattern that explains his longevity. He did not chase the biggest headline or the newest scheme. He assembled small, reliable streams and protected them by making sure his interests overlapped with those of public figures who controlled pressure points. He invested in land, trucks, and companies that gave his life a shape that was hard to attack head-on. He relied on predictability. When storms came legal, political, or literal, he moved business a few blocks over, waited, and resumed. That patience is what investigators kept running into. Not a fortress to storm, but a maze of rooms with doors that always opened quietly and closed without a sound. The cost of that patience fell on the city's fabric. Owners who refused to play by his rules found suppliers drying up and inspections landing at awkward times. Honest deputies watched colleagues bend. Voters saw public money routed by relationships rather than merit. And yet, for years, most days looked calm. Streets were busy. Jukeboxes played. Bookmakers paid on Mondays. Calm in this case was not peace. It was the settling dust of arrangements that kept pressure off those inside the circle and shifted it onto those standing outside. He left no grand confession to tidy the record. What we have are charges that stuck, charges that didn't, testimony from people who wanted leniency, and a paper trail of companies and deeds that show how money moved. From that you can assemble a portrait without adding paint. A child from the Mediterranean port of Tunis, a youth in the French market, a careful climber who learned to convert proximity to public power into private protection, a man who sat through televised questions without blinking, an operator removed from the country and back again, a defendant finally pinned by a statute designed to capture exactly what he had spent a lifetime practicing, an elder who outlived the height of his own influence. If you trace the years across a map, you can mark the points that mattered most. The market district where routine replaced school, the parish line where plush rooms drew headlines, the farm that anchored his quiet office, the courthouse where he invoked rights or listened while lawyers did the talking, the federal facility where the days moved slowly enough for memory to get loud, the cemetery where the story ended in a short ceremony. Each point carries its own lesson about how a city accommodates and resists the people who learn to turn its bends into cover. He is part of New Orleans history not because he sought fame, but because he showed how power can look like paperwork, how control can sound like a friendly suggestion, and how a long run can be built from thousands of small, careful moves. The ledger of crimes attached to his name: illegal gambling, conspiracy, bribery, racketeering, assaults tied to disputes with agents. The early marijuana case sits alongside a ledger of missed chances by institutions that should have closed gaps sooner. In the end, law caught up, aided by tools that finally fit the problem. Time did the rest. And the city, with its deep wells of memory and reinvention, folded his chapter into the larger story it tells about commerce, culture, and the stubborn ways people try to bend rules without making waves. People who watched him over the years used different lenses. Detectives remembered a man who rarely raised his voice, who preferred a short nod to a long speech, and who seemed to move a lot by moving very little. Reporters remembered chase days when a lead sent them to a diner, a farm gate, or a courthouse bench, only to end with a quiet exit through a side door. Neighbors remembered a family man who waved from a car and did not linger. Those fragments fit together when you set them against the long record. A life built on small transactions, steady pressure, and a knack for turning public processes into private leverage. His rise taught him to value routine. He used fixed days for collections, fixed routes for trucks, fixed meeting spots that felt ordinary to anyone not paying close attention. That routine gave comfort to people paying into the system. A club owner knew that as long as he followed the schedule, he would open his doors without surprise. A bookmaker knew that as long as the cut went up on time, phones would stay quiet, and deputies would find other priorities on busy weekends. When trouble did come, it tended to be deliberate and measured: a license delayed, a delivery rerouted, a landlord who suddenly discovered a clause in a lease. Those tools were less risky than threats, and they were easier to explain away. The early file on him shows how quickly this kind of work pulls a person into courtrooms. In 1938, he was convicted on a marijuana offense and sent to prison. He served his time and came out with an even lower profile. That case marked him as a person of interest to federal agents, who watched the vending routes, the card rooms, and the partners who seemed to move with him from venture to venture. Arrests for gambling-related counts and public corruption probes followed in later years, sometimes landing, sometimes failing. Across the decades, the paperwork piles up into a pattern. He found ways to convert the city's appetite for games and music into cash, and then to convert that cash into influence that softened the edges of enforcement. The other central fact is how closely his world ran alongside public offices. Sheriffs and parish administrators controlled licenses and inspections. City boards controlled zoning and permits. State agencies controlled contracts that could yield large, predictable payments. He learned to build relationships there. That did not always mean exchanging stacks of money in parking lots. Often it meant campaign help, introductions to donors, or paid consulting that gave an official, plausible cover. Investigators who later laid out the case against him said that these were the means by which illicit gambling and related businesses stayed open. Defense counsel answered that he ran legitimate companies, that he contributed like any other business owner, and that he could not control what others did once he left a room. Juries weighed those claims many times. For years, fragmentation helped him. Only when laws changed to let prosecutors tie threads together did the results shift. He built on a foundation others had laid. Before the war, Silver Dollar Sam Carollo had shaped the city's rackets. Post-war deportations and pressure created openings. He filled them with patience. He partnered with national gamblers who had long looked to New Orleans as a reliable market. The plush clubs at the parish line, especially in the 1940s and early 1950s, showed how those partnerships worked. Local managers handled permits and day-to-day logistics, while visitors with deep pockets and big reputations helped draw crowds. When raids and politics made those rooms riskier, he leaned harder on the roots and on private games that did not draw headlines. He did not chase novelty. He reduced exposure by spreading the take across many small rooms. Television made his name in the early 1950s, when the Kefauver Committee turned hearings into a national show. He did not give the senators much. He sat tight, identified himself, and declined to answer questions that would have exposed him to legal risk. The country learned that there were organized systems behind the slot machines and card rooms they had heard about. Back home, the city returned to its old balance after the cameras left. Machines came and went. Bookmakers adjusted their lines. Sheriffs traded places. He kept his seat at the center by acting as a buffer between money and power. The 1,961 removal to Guatemala was a rare moment of spectacle. He was picked up, flown out, and left in a place he had not known as home. He returned in short order. The legal battle over his status became a long technical fight. Courts later ruled parts of the government's action improper. Perjury and false statement cases pursued him over the details of his entry and paperwork. He faced a separate conviction for assaulting a federal agent after a tense encounter linked to constant surveillance. Each entry in the docket carried weight, but none cut him away from the daily operations that defined his reach. He treated those setbacks as costs of the line he had chosen. A cloud settled over his name after 1963, when the murder of a president sent searches back through every city that might hold motive or means. New Orleans, with its ties to several figures who drifted through that story, drew intense interest. District Attorney Jim Garrison's broad probe splashed names in headlines, including his. Federal inquiries in the 1970s revisited that world. Informants offered stories. Some said he had voiced hatred for the administration that had tried to deport him. Others placed him near people who later made their own dark history. Committees weighed and filed those claims. They found many possibilities and little proof that could stand up in court. He was never charged in that matter. He declined to help the rumor mill, answering only when compelled, and then only within the law's narrow allowances. The major legal shift that finally altered his course came with RICO and more sophisticated undercover tactics. The FBI built a case around bribery in labor-linked insurance. An informant posed as a broker selling coverage for public employees and unions. The broker offered fees and political help for those who could steer contracts. Recordings captured many voices working out how to do that without leaving fingerprints. He appeared on those tapes weighing risks, asking who could vouch for whom, and suggesting buffers. Prosecutors said the cautious tone itself showed leadership and intent. The defense said it proved hesitancy. Jurors convicted him on racketeering and conspiracy counts in the early 1980s. He received a long federal sentence and a fine. Appeals in later years adjusted edges, and broader legal changes in mail fraud doctrine forced courts across the country to revisit parts of cases like his. Still, he had served years by the time those ripples reached him, and his absence had already reshaped his world. Prison drew new stories. Fellow inmates claimed to have heard him claim credit for acts that no court had pinned on him. One said he had confessed to the biggest of them all. Agents listened to those accounts and compared them to what they already knew. They did not bring new charges on that basis. The claims remain part of the folklore that grew up around him, loud stories told by men who had reasons to seek leverage, without the kind of corroboration prosecutors need. While he served his time, the market he had built began to fray. The people he trusted most held portions steady. Others pushed for quick wins and drew fire. Law enforcement joined hands across parishes and the federal line, sharing tips and building cases with the patients that had once been his main advantage. When he returned, age and health kept him from taking back the day-to-day work. The rise of regulated gaming channeled some wagers away from the back rooms that had funded his system for so long, and technology changed the way bookmakers operated. Cell phones, pagers, and later digital tools created both new risks and new methods of tracking. Old habits did not fit as well. The public memory of him split into two portraits. One shows a quiet, relentless businessman who built an underground economy that felt normal to many who used it. The other shows a symbol of everything that bent the region's institutions away from fairness. Both portraits contain truth. He organized illicit gambling and protected it with influence. He used businesses to disguise the flow of money and to give officials plausible excuses for improper favors. He fought taxes and assessments that threatened his base. He avoided flash, which helped him outlast men who liked attention. He warned against narcotics and violence because he believed they drew heat that would burn the rest. The record shows that he benefited from a system that put those who paid at an advantage and those who refused at a disadvantage. It also shows that agencies often took years to coordinate well enough to make a full case. Set against the city's longer story, his career reads like a manual on how corruption can settle in when oversight is weak and when everyday commerce offers cover. Jukeboxes and pinball look harmless, until you see how the contracts behind them tie to bribes for licenses and selective enforcement. A consulting invoice looks lawful until you learn it paid for a change in priority at an office that should have treated all applicants equally. A real estate loan looks like business until you learn that missing a payment means losing a location because the lender and the permitting agency share friends. None of that involves spectacle. All of it erodes trust. He passed in 1993. The obituaries were cautious. They listed what could be documented: the early conviction, the Senate hearing, the deportation fight, the assault case, the long RICO sentence, the ties to businesses that moved cash, the persistent allegations he denied, the years of silence that defined his method. Friends spoke of loyalty, family, and a preference for ordinary meals over fancy rooms. Critics spoke of the long civic bill his influence had run up. Both sets of voices agreed that he had changed the way the city talked about hidden power. The lessons people draw depend on where they start. Law enforcement officers point to the slow build of task forces, the value of wiretaps and undercover patients, and the way new statutes can finally match the shape of an old problem. Journalists point to the need for watchdogs like the Metropolitan Crime Commission, for editors willing to run stories that seem repetitive until the repetition itself becomes the point, and for readers who understand that not every victory looks like a raid on page 1. Business owners point to the erosion was slow rather than spectacular, which fit the way he had built the machine in the first place. On release, he stepped back into a city that had shifted. Technology altered betting. Pagers and early mobile phones changed how wagers moved and how investigators tracked them. Regulated gaming crept in, first in pieces, then with more certainty. Video poker and riverboats arrived under state oversight, changing the margins on the underground economy he had long supplied. The old racket did not vanish, but legal options took a share of the demand and brought cameras, audits, and regulations that dull the appeal of envelopes and winks. In that environment, his habit of quiet walks on the farm and short meetings at familiar tables made more sense as ritual than as management. The civic picture around him evolved too. Watchdogs like the Metropolitan Crime Commission kept at it, documenting deals that still slipped between rules and warning about new loopholes. Journalists found audiences willing to read about procurement, zoning, and ethics, subjects that once felt too dry to compete with crime scenes. Prosecutors built mixed teams that combined local knowledge with federal tools. Courts adjusted doctrines. One Supreme Court ruling in the late 1980s narrowed the reach of mail fraud theories based on intangible rights, forcing revisions in some corruption cases. Even with those changes, the racketeering counts that captured his pattern held. The core conclusion endures. He had used businesses and influence to organize an illicit market and to bend public functions to protect it. People sometimes ask whether a person like him could do the same thing now. The honest answer begins with caution. The city still loves music, games, and a deal. Human nature does not change. What has changed is the cost of secrecy. Cameras are everywhere, data flows faster, and agencies share more. Statutes that once seemed exotic are now familiar tools. Juries understand the idea of an enterprise and a pattern in ways they did not when he started. That does not erase corruption. It narrows the space where a system like his can operate without leaving a long digital trail. What lasts is the lesson about the pressure points where private gain captures public function. He found those points in licensing, inspections, zoning, and contracts. He learned to make friends where decisions were small but constant. He built companies that gave him plausible roles in ordinary commerce. He valued patience over force, routine over spectacle, and predictability over sudden scores. That method kept him in place for decades and complicates any attempt to reduce his life to a single headline. The headlines are there: kefauver, deportation, the corruption sting, the racketeering sentence, but the daily reality was envelopes, schedules, leases, and quiet yeses. The list of harms is equally daily. A tavern that would not play ball lost a route and struggled. A club that paid saw a competitor kneecapped by paperwork rather than fists. A deputy who took envelopes learned to look away from some crimes and to look hard at others, according to who paid. Voters saw public money routed by private ties. Those harms add up. Over time, they shape a city's sense of fairness and possibility. The reforms that followed ethics boards with stronger teeth, procurement rules with more transparency, Term limits that rotate power are part of his legacy too, even if his name appears nowhere on those statutes. He died in 1993. The funeral was brief and private. Obituaries sketch the familiar arc. Born in Tunis to Sicilian parents, raised in the French market, early arrests, rise through vending and gambling, televised refusals in a Senate hearing, a dramatic removal and return, years of legal fights, a sweeping conviction under laws designed for the job, a late life of routine under changing skies. Friends described loyalty, a steady manner, and a taste for ordinary meals. Critics listed the civic cost. Both views meet in the record, which shows a person who understood how to turn a city's rhythms into protection for a hidden market and who paid for that with time and, at the end, with a name that still makes rooms go quiet. Even now, when people in Louisiana talk about hidden influence, they reach for his story. They mention the farm office set among citrus and canals as a symbol of how power can hide in plain sight. They mention the jukebox routes to explain how small transactions can fund large favors. They mention the corruption case to show how long it can take for law to match method. They mention the cloud of rumors to remind us how gaps in proof can be filled by imagination. They mention the calm, because that remains the defining image. A man who moved levers by barely moving at all. And that was the story of Carlos Marcello, the quiet but commanding boss of New Orleans, who ruled with influence that reached far beyond the streets. His empire, once built in whispers and shadows, now drifts into history's silence. Thank you for joining me tonight here at the Silent Empires. Share your city and the time you're listening down in the comments. I always enjoy seeing where these stories find you. And if you haven't already, subscribe so you never miss another tale of gangsters and the empires they left behind. Rest easy, dream deeply, and good night.